Welcome to Fast Times, episode 2. Today we're going to talk about communication. The Democratic Party has a toxic brand. We have failed to deliver, and so voters don't trust us. But to win back trust, we need to figure out how to communicate with people. But the problem is our leadership seems totally out of touch, and no one really knows how to respond to Trump and get shit done and win voters back. And so today, our guest on the show is doing things differently. He's actually figured out how to set an example for the combative centrism that people on Twitter are talking about. And he's not afraid to both get into fights online, but also win them when it comes to things like the abundance agenda that gets a lot of people like us excited. And so today we're going to talk about how you build a follower and a movement on Twitter. We're going to talk about what Dems can learn nationally from San Francisco and talk about how to rebuild a party that can deliver for voters. So I'm excited to welcome Armand onto the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So I guess my first question for you is, and I'll just get right to it. Like, what is the playbook that Democratic leaders can use to get more aggressive or combative against all of the bullshit that's coming out of the Trump administration?
Well, at least when it comes to social media, but I think it goes for communication overall. There's like a real need for, everybody says it, but like authenticity. And I think part of the challenge for Democrats has always been that we like overly test and think through, and everything we say is sort of like designed with this idea of like, how can we minimize the potential that anybody could be possibly offended by this? And so like when people say that Donald Trump talks about like says it like it is, they don't really mean that he says the truth, but he talks to you like a person who's not calculating every little thing he says. And then when Kamala Harris spoke, who was like a very eloquent person who I tried really hard to elect and who I really like, but she'd speak in like paragraphs that were like designed explicitly to like use the right language and use the right phrasing. And I remember this moment during the State of the Union where Joe Biden like kind of garbled something. He was like pushing back on Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it was like what she said was that this illegal immigrant had killed somebody, and he said, well, like, what about all the illegals who kill somebody? Which is like, and he got
the right substance but the wrong style.
Well, no, what I mean by that is that this is an election where like voters are really frustrated about immigration. And the substance of what he was saying was actually a defense of immigrants, but a lot of like left-leaning groups and people were really critical of him for using like the language of illegal immigrant. And then Joe Biden afterwards like gave an interview and he's like, oh, I'm so sorry about that and everything. And it's like, this is an election where the main criticism of you is that you're like not tough enough on like immigration issues at the border. And you made a really combative, strong response, which was talking about like how like trying to blame all crime on immigrants is bad, but you like use the wrong terminology and you're like going forward and making an apology about it, right? And that's just like, to me, that crystallized everything about how Democrats are so like painstakingly obsessed with saying exactly the right thing and apologizing if we don't. And people can tell it feels fake and it feels calculated. And part of the reason that like a lot of people across the party who do well, I would say, is not even ideologically consistent. Like Bernie Sanders, even if you disagree with him, sounds like somebody who like really believes what he's talking about. Then there are folks like, I think John Fetterman, like I strongly disagree with him on a lot, but he really does seem to believe like the things he's saying, and he says with real authenticity, and has like support from different factions because of that.
Well, Tom and I were talking about this last night because I think this is all like tangled into the woke DEI stuff where Democrats, and I personally believe that diversity is good and inclusion is good and equal opportunity is good. But somehow that then gets like twisted stylistically into like, oh, we then need to respect each of those groups. And then that can go further and be like, oh, we have to use certain words or terminologies. And so like, is there a way to preserve our commitment to diversity and inclusion while still like speaking authentically and normally, even if it's like a little bit offensive or not exactly what somebody says is the right way to say it?
And I think this is where the Democrats get in trouble. And I think it was reflected in the election results when you look at how people voted by age. So people that are Gen X, like my generation, kind of trended more to the center or center right on these issues. And it's hard because the Democrats have the bigger tent, right? They have this big tent where they have a lot of dissenting voices in it. And that's what makes the Democratic Party actually better in a lot of ways, because There's more opinions that get voiced. More people have a platform to say what they want to say. Even if I deeply disagree with some things that Bernie and AOC has to say, that's what democracy is really all about, right? Is being able to say those things. Whereas on the right, obviously, there's very little dissension, and when there is dissension, they immediately get removed, right, from any kind of discourse or platform that they were on quite often, right? So they do present a unified message, and that served them this time, because what Adam was saying, coming back to what Adam was saying, is that when we talk about the DEI and the inclusion and equity and all those things, there was also a subgroup of people that were going around basically telling you that you should feel bad about who you are, about what your belief system is, because of the color of your skin or because of how you were brought up. And while I can understand that there's resentment and there needs to be some type of correction made to really have that true equality of opportunity that Dr. King talked about so long ago, making people feel bad about who they are, I don't think was the way to do it. And that's kind of what I was telling Adam last night. And so the Democrats need to figure out a way that they can have all these people under this tent where they're not actually doing litmus tests on everybody to determine whether or not they're worthy of being in this party or not. And I think that you see that on the hard left. You see that to an extent in the social justice framework and the social justice movement about you have to agree with our entire agenda. If you disagree on one issue, like the Israel-Palestine issue, you can't be part of us. And I think that that's a really a detrimental mistake that they're making.
Well, I think part of it too is that like we got kind of far away from actual practical things that like the groups are claiming to speak for care about. At this point, like people rehash like the Latinx thing like a zillion times, but also if you look at like there are so many democratic like policymaking people or influencers, intellectuals I've talked to who are blown away or just like refuse to accept that within the Democratic Party on social issues, the most conservative parts of our coalition are Black voters, Hispanic voters, and Asian American voters. And so, like, I'm someone I grew up, my parents are refugees. I grew up in very working class, diverse communities. I still have like a lot of my friends from all steps of life. And frankly, like some of the most like socially conservative things, to the point where like had a conversation with them about it and like we agreed and figured it out. We just had an open dialogue, but like we're not like white people. And so like this whole idea that like the demand like there's a real disconnect where there's people are saying like, we want diversity and inclusion, but then we did it in ways that were not even asked for or wanted by the people we're supposed to include because we allowed like people are really not representative of those communities of like the most elite members. And this happens in all discourses, like in disability discourse, for example, like a lot of it is dominated by people who are like high functioning Asperger or high functioning autism and are really eloquent and smart. And oftentimes, like the things they're advocating for are very disconnected from the experiences and needs of like most people suffer from those disabilities. And you see this too, where like a lot of, and I saw that I worked at progressive nonprofits and so on. Some most like radical left-wing people would be people of color in our nonprofits who went to Ivy Leagues and so on. But then if you look at like what their opinions are, for example, like on energy issues, like oil, fossil fuels, like should we prioritize costs over like climate, just worlds apart from like the median Democratic voter who's like Black or Latino. And so I think like part of the answer there is like we need to actually like listen to what those communities are saying and not just like I don't know what we want them to say or like what like a few people who are very disconnected from the lived experience of most of those communities tell us that those people think like um I'm going to rant here, but just the last things like on immigration, for example, like immigration issue with Latino voters last cycle consistently like were more conservative than like white Democratic voters. And one of the reasons that they cited for supporting Trump, many of them were on immigration. Yet for the longest time, there's this consensus Democratic Party that the way you win over Latino voters is by being more pro-immigration, right? And like, and assumed that that would mean that people wouldn't want more enforcement on illegal immigration, but it wasn't true.
My wife is an immigrant, so she came here from the Philippines when she was 7, and she's pro-immigration. I'm pro-immigration, but there's a difference between pro-immigration and 12 million people coming across the border. And it's funny when the Democrats talk about immigration and with the way they frame it, they don't frame it as a border crisis where there's undocumented, or as the Republicans say, illegal aliens coming across the border. They just frame it as immigration. And I think that, and so my wife actually is kind of sort of offended by that, because
No.
she's like, my parents waited they had to be petitioned and waited 10 years for the petition to come through to come to the United States. One of my mother-in-law's aunts petitioned them to come. And you've got these other folks that are just, coming up from Venezuela, walking across the border, and there's a difference. And I think that the Democrats spent too much time pretending that there's not a difference, and it came back to bite them really hard, because it turns out that people actually, America's a little jingoist sometimes, we are, and to our detriment.
Yeah, there's a truism in social science research where the most conservative portion of the population socioeconomically isn't the lowest, most impoverished folks. It's people who are right above the poverty line, because it's those people who are like, well, I'm over the poverty line because I'm working 2 jobs and supporting my kids, and I'm not on drugs, and my kids in school, and those other people right below me are taking advantage of the system, and they're taking benefits even when they're not doing a good job. And so you typically, like, the people under the poverty line tend to be quite liberal. People at the top of the ladder tend to be quite liberal, but it's like the lower middle class that has historically always been pretty conservative when it comes to like who gets benefits. I guess one of my points is that Democrats historically have done exactly what I've done. They've cited research and stats to make our point, and on immigration or on crime or on the economy, our response over the last couple of years has been no, like, you don't understand, like, just look at the facts. And we did this here in San Francisco with crime, like, oh, crime's actually going down. And we did it with the border, like, oh, you're miscounting, when in fact what people feel, how they feel their bank accounts look, how they feel they're progressing or not, matters a lot more to how they vote than like what we say the facts are. But I find that to be like, I think, yeah, we've talked about this ad nauseum, but then what do we do now when like the facts or what's happening in Washington, D.C. is like he's ripping everything apart. He's destroying a lot of stuff. We can't use like facts as substance anymore, as proxy. Like, how do we combat what's happening when like facts don't matter?
Well, I think some of it, frankly, the left broadly, right, I include myself in the left, doesn't like confronting, is that we lost trust, in part because there's a real like deluge of right-wing attacks on institutions, but also because like we made very visible, there were very visible moments where we ourselves undermined institutions. I think about like during COVID, there's this period of time where everyone's like, all public health people were saying like, you need to wear masks everywhere, keep wearing masks. And I was a person who like wore masks indoors the whole time. But like as the research came in and I realized that like outdoor mask wearing, particularly in like big open spaces, did not make any difference. I no longer like wore it outside. But then when the Black Lives Matters protests happened, suddenly like public health experts were like putting their name and official institutional like imprint on statements saying like, oh, well, now it's okay. And so a lot of folks like who disagreed politically or more right wing saw that and said like, wait, so you're telling us all this is like neutral science, but then it's like okay to disregard it for your political cause, right? Like, and they understood like they wouldn't have said that if it was like a Tea Party rally, or even like on immigration. Every time I tried to talk to folks about like the details and substance of what was actually happening, which is that we have an asylum system and not enough judges and asylum officers. And so what ended up happening is like the more folks came in and sought asylum, and they have a legal right according to US law and treaty law to like get a hearing on it and everything, the longer these processes got, and it became like very well known in like immigrant communities and like throughout the world that like if you came to the US, you could petition for asylum, get a work permit,
Stay forever.
and stay for many years. And like your worst case was like which is a lot of immigrants want to do anyway, stay here for 6 years, save up enough money and go home. But even acknowledging that, like admitting that this was happening and therefore like, and the United States cannot sustain, like if everybody in the world wanted to come here, like our social welfare system isn't set up for that and a bunch of different things that wouldn't work. But you even touch around those edges, and people just get like angry, tell you're anti-immigrant. And so they,
Racist, all those things. Yeah.
right. And so like, I think part of the issue around like the whole facts thing, I agree with you that like we need to do more to meet the moment how people feel, but also if like we want people to trust us on facts, we need to be willing to acknowledge them, even if they're politically uncomfortable for us.
Who do you think are the most effective communicators right now on the left?
I mean, I think like Bernie, AOC, more on like the left. I think on the center, like Ezra Klein. In terms of politicians in the center, I don't think anyone's really like caught like the moment. There are individuals I really like Jake Auchincloss, but I think he's like really very intellectual. So I wouldn't necessarily say he's like a big, broad mainstream communicator, but like Pete Buttigieg is really good. You're talking about authenticity earlier. It's like a lot of Democratic politicians like took that memo and now like are swearing more, but it comes off as so like fake.
Yeah.
Like somebody put up like a graphic where
Dude.
like Senator Tammy Duckworth is like looking very presentable and nice and formal, and then she says, "This is fucking blah blah blah," and it's like that feels so fake.
The whole
Yeah.
Jasmine Crockett thing, like, man, the whole calling Governor Abbott Governor Hot Wheels, and using the cuss words and all of that, and it's
Actually,
I don't know.
I will
So-
say like I think with her, I don't like what she said about him, but I think it's authentic. That's how she
Oh,
talks.
probably, I'm just saying that because, and I think Bill Maher was saying this too about, she's been put up on this national platform, or at least it appears that way. I don't really think she is. I don't think she's as important as the media is making her out to be, right? I think AOC has a lot more of a following than Jasmine Crockett does, as an example, or Bernie, even though he's like 90 years old now. So that's another thing. I'm tired.
What do you guys make of them? Because I think like they seem to have broken through yet again. AOC and Bernie. I mean, they're in person and online. They're, I think, the most effective combatants to what's happening in the Trump administration. But they're pushing a policy platform that at least the Democratic Party has rejected twice. And I think a lot of the polls show that most Democrats would prefer a much more centrist platform. But yet, so we have I think our most effective leaders are pushing ideas that like aren't what people want. Like how do you square that circle?
Well, the thing about Bernie that's always made him really effective as a politician is that there's this weird trend in the Democratic Party for a while. We wanted to present the most like milquetoast policies in the most radical terms. So people would be like, we're for reparations. And by reparations, we mean this like tax credit program, which gives a small like subsidy to a bond that you can get 18 years later if you're in like these census zones. But Bernie does the opposite, where he's like, we'll present ideas that people like Medicare for all would be like very big transformation in the United States. And it's one I support, but it would be like a pretty big change. And he's like, this is a common sense idea. It's like totally normal and reasonable. And that's what makes him really smart, is that he does not like present his ideas as very radical. Even if a lot of them are. And I don't mean them as like a negative, like I support a lot of them, but that's part of what's made him very effective. And if you look at how he's running, some of it's like everybody just like, people are really mad at Schumer. Even though like I personally think is like a tough call, like there are a lot of negative consequences if there's a shutdown. I don't know what I would have decided, but people really want to fight. They feel very powerless, right? Like Trump is wrecking everything and it feels like we can't do anything. And they're up there and they're out there and they are making a statement about fighting. But they're also like focusing on, like Bernie's not going around talking about like we need to do a wealth tax. Bernie's not going around talking about like we need to do open borders. Like he's going around talking about protect Medicare, Social Security. Like he's being smart about like the things that you talked about that like folks didn't agree with. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the things that are extremely popular. So I think like combining a popular message with like taking the fight, but also like that, like the people in the party, like Bernie's part of the party has always had like very intense devotion, like in terms of like donations, right? Like they had the most small donors and they always like putting up that map. But having a smaller group of people who's very intense will show up to all of your things doesn't translate always to like winning a lot of voters, right? Like Donald Trump won in part because he got a lot of infrequent voters. People were not showing up to special elections, not going to show up to midterms. To win a broad general election, like you can't just win over the people, like a small group of people really hardcore. You need to speak to the person who doesn't really care about politics, like a lot of people.
So if you were, I mean, I'm curious, we're all like armchair experts, especially all Twitter is like full of people like us. But if you were like in charge of the Democratic Party, you had the microphones in front of you, like how do you think we should be responding to Trump?
Well, I'll say one thing is like that actually touches on like a core issue, which is that people tend to think they'll be like the DNC did this. And like when you've been working in Democratic politics and understand it for a long time and are like, we all know because we've all been involved locally, it's like a zillion fucking cats like trying to be herded everywhere. There's no like, until you have a presidential nominee, really, like you don't have someone who's like, I am the voice of the party. That said, if that existed, um, I think the strongest points of attack are around like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
But he
which,
hasn't
like,
touched those yet. Like that's all still just a fear.
well, already with Social Security, they've cut like the phone lines, right? And the phone access.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, like, I don't know if you guys have any elderly relatives, but the idea that my dad is gonna like go on his computer and like figure out how to like file a complaint if his Social Security is not working is like ridiculous. Like he's gonna call somebody. Um, And what they're doing a lot of is they know it's politically unpopular to just do cuts. And so they're trying to do this is what they do with work requirements. With Medicaid is like study after study has shown that work requirements on Medicaid do not increase work participation. What they do is they take Medicaid from people who are like forgot to fill out a form, right? And so they're trying to hit people in like these indirect ways, but ultimately like they want to cut all these taxes and either they don't pay for it and we have like insane inflation or they try to pay for it and they've already said like in their budget resolution that they need to find cuts from $880 billion cuts from like a section of the budget which is almost entirely Medicaid. So I think you got to try to make news around these popular things, but part of the issue is the media does not tend to cover things like Social Security and Medicaid. You'll see all Democratic ads are about it, and there's never news stories about it. And then there's news stories about like the Signal chat leak, which like is a big fuck up, but like the voters consistently don't really care that much about foreign policy. And so I think part of what you have to do is like find those news hooks and then always pivot to the things that you want to talk about. So I did this protest against Donald Trump like a couple months ago during the election, and I wore all this. I got folks' attention because I wore this patriotic garb, I had a giant flag. When folks came to interview me, I talked about abortion and protecting reproductive rights. And even though it wasn't like the central topic of this protest or anything, but I knew that's something important to me. And it also was like our strongest issue in this election. And so I wanted to make sure that like when news clips of this crazy guy with a flag fighting a Trump protest was out there would be a line in there that's like, he's coming after your abortion rights. So finding ways to pivot conversations and like move quickly to the topics that are good for us.
What would you do, Tom?
Yeah.
So that was a really good explanation. I'm impressed, man. So look, it's hard because I'm kind of a middle of the road Democrat, I guess. I guess I'm a moderate, but I've seen the polls too. 42% of registered Democrats want the Democratic Party to collaborate with Donald Trump. So the Democrats are in a conundrum, okay, as a party. Do they roll with AOC and Bernie and risk alienating that 42% of voters that want some type of collaboration with the current administration to get shit done? Or do they capitulate to that 42% and then really piss off the far left and risk losing them? So And this is the, like you were saying, this is the herding of the cats. This is the super big tent thing. And what's interesting is that for me and my political views, I think we should collaborate on some things with Trump. I think the fentanyl issue. I think drug policy. I think the border. I think we need to be collaborating with him on the Republicans on finding some kind of, middle ground. And I think we kind of did with the Halt Fentanyl Act, which is about to get signed into law, which is going to permanently schedule fentanyl as a Schedule I drug. And I know that's kind of off, but that's one example where there was wide and broad bipartisanship in Congress to get that over the finish line. And so I would like to see that on some issues. And then some issues, yeah, we should fight like hell. And what's interesting to me is that, and this may be an oversimplification, but Ezra Klein did that interview with who's the guy he just did the interview with?
Jon Stewart?
Yeah, Jon Stewart. And he talked about how the 59 million steps in order to get funding for the broadband stuff and for EV chargers, right? And he was saying, after all that, after everything is done in 3 years, now they're ready to just get the money, not actually build anything. And so I wonder, and don't bite my heads off, guys, how far away is that from what Doge is doing in regards to trying to slash some of the wastefulness? I understand that Elon is going in there with a chainsaw. I agree. Okay. But how far away is the actual concept of trying to make that process more efficient from what Doge is trying to do to reduce the waste?
Well, I know it's a hypothetical question, but
Right.
I will answer it,
Okay.
which is far. Like, I think there's a difference between making government work better and cutting government entirely. I think generally Americans across both parties have a dim view of government. It clearly doesn't work. It doesn't produce results. The problem is that only one party is defending government, our party. And so we get penalized for this, not the other side. But I don't think that Trump or Elon Musk are trying with Doge to make government work better. They're not looking at procurement reform or permitting processes, or like, let's take a process that has 50 steps and make it have 3 steps. So let's figure out how to digitize it or automate it, or auto enroll. Like there's many things we could, or they could be doing to make existing programs work better. And yes, they'd probably save money at the same time and improve outcomes, but that's not what he's doing. They're going in there and they're cutting. They're canceling contracts, they're firing people, they're laying people off, they're getting rid of contractors. It's a cost-cutting exercise, which is not bad. Like there is probably waste and fraud and inefficiency, but I think what they're not going to solve, I think, the fundamental problem that people are angry about, which is that people want government to, in exchange for paying taxes, to provide them with low quality, high quality access to housing, to education, to healthcare, to childcare. They expect government to help them get access to a basic value prop of living like a modern life in an advanced country. And our government doesn't do that. I think you can make an argument that Europe's governments do that a lot better than our governments do that. And I think people are fucking angry about it because yes, you can buy a TV or a cell phone for much cheaper than you could 10, 20, 30 years ago, but the cost of goods that get you access to wealth, like education and healthcare, have gone way, way up, and housing by extension. And I don't think that at a local, state, or national level, Democrats have delivered on that. And so I think, it's easy to tear down stuff. It's easy to fire people and eliminate stuff. It's really hard to build new things, and that's, I guess, why I'm a builder by nature. My career is as a founder. I start things and the messaging to me about protecting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid is half good, because I'm those are they're literally called entitlements. It's things that are given to you. They're not a positive vision for the country. They're money that you can expect if you're poor or you're sick or you're old. But I think where's the vision for what we want for ourselves? What should America be? I think Donald Trump is painting a vision for what America should be, which is everyone's for themselves. It's a zero-sum game. Everything's transactional. Get yours. But no one on our side is saying well, what should America look like? And I don't think Kamala did it. I don't think Gavin Newsom is doing it. And it just bothers me, because it just feels like we're protecting these things that were created 40 to 70 years ago, instead of telling people what we're going to do. Why should they vote for us? What are we going to build for them? How would their lives be better in 4 years? So I don't know. It just feels like we're protecting, we're arguing oh, don't cut this thing that is generally unpopular to begin with, and yeah, it's like really expensive, and I don't know, it feels like weak, like that.
I get that. I think part of like the recent book came out, Abundance, and one thing I really liked is like the intro is this like very optimistic vision of like what could be, right? Like we'll have like high-speed rail trains and homes in dense walkable neighborhoods that are affordable, like so much clean energy that we can do like desalination and like vertical farming and it's like it's very clear that the book is a like super optimistic, like that's just like if everything goes right, here's what we could have. um but I think part of the reason I'm hesitant to want to be like sell that vision is like I don't think it's credible right now because we're not delivering, right? Like Los Angeles had this giant fire, and since that fire, there have been 4 units permitted in reconstruction. 4. Like, and if anything, like the city made all these statements about streamlining and so on, but they are so afraid of like, what if they build it wrong? Or like, what if like they add an ADU and like this guy who's like ADU permits, like Gavin Newsom had an executive order to say like ADUs shouldn't require all this extra process or whatever. But then the mayor's office in Los Angeles like took another 30 days or something to like officially accept or like put out language saying here's how we'll interpret this executive order. And we're just paralyzed. And so like I want to sell a really positive, optimistic vision, but nobody's gonna fucking believe me. Like high-speed rail is like a recurring joke. I was 18 years old when I heard Obama talking about it. And now it's like maybe we'll get something between, Bakersfield and Merced.
Like I don't think Karen Bass is not going to build shit. I don't think Gavin Newsom's going to build shit because if they would have already started. But I think like someone has to like I think a new generation of Democratic
Yeah.
leaders have to promise something and then you have to deliver.
Right.
And I think like the brilliance of Donald Trump's executive orders is that he's like found this like loophole, and like it was used by Obama and then by first Trump and then by Biden, but he's obviously exploded it into like basically a way to at least like intimate progress, if not like actually realize it. And even though it's like executive fiat, like it's with the whole way our court system works and such, it's like by the time it gets challenged and it gets a decision, like it'll already be implemented, or at least people will have reacted as if it's implemented. Like I think all the DEI stuff, even if it gets invalidated or firing people from agencies, like yeah, if even if they're called back, like those people have moved on, they're at other jobs. It's like it's messaging that has become reality through executive order, and it's like a brilliant way to basically like make his vision real. Why couldn't a Democrat do that?
I think part of the thing about that's really disturbing is that the reason there's an appetite for this, like I don't think there's any point in my lifetime where like there would have been a big movement of people that would just say like, fuck what the court says. I don't care if it's illegal. It's like they'll just say like the courts are like we should impeach them for like routine decisions. But the reason that there's like a real hunger for this is because people do feel that government is like ossified, it doesn't do anything, it's stuck in endless process. Like how many I've been in San Francisco for 10 years, and literally every election there's like somebody running and saying we're going to streamline things for small business. I've heard that phrase every single time. Right? And then it's still the case that like recently there was a guy who like wanted his sink wanted to put in a sink in like the restaurant he was doing, but this part of like the restaurant was actually not zoned like the right exact way, and everybody agreed that it should be fixed, but it still took like over a year. And you can get stuck because like an inspector will like disagree with your interpretation of this, and then even if it turns out they agree at the end, just getting an appointment with them takes 6 more months. Like everybody like keeps saying the same things over and over again, and then nothing happens, and then you have this, if you explain why, it becomes like something like Ezra talked about, like, well, this law was interpreted this way and there's a court process, and people don't want to hear that. They just want shit to get done. And I think the real danger is that the more ossified we become, if we don't act on this, people will want a strongman, because he's promising to like cut through all the bullshit, and he's doing it in a really horrible and destructive way. But like, it is in large part our fault that it got to the point where people are hungry for that. I mean, think about like Joe Biden paid for all this money for all this implementation through the CHIPS Act for these factories that now like Trump is doing tours of and taking credit for because they didn't open until he came into office.
You had mentioned that prior, Adam, that was the case.
Yeah,
He was going to swoop in and take credit.
of course, yeah, because it takes so fucking long to get stuff implemented. But it's at some point we have to break the cycle because like we all agree, or at least we three agree. Our side of
Yeah.
Twitter agrees on the problem. But I'm more curious about like, well, how do we get out of the loop? Because it's like, and I'm not trying to take away credit from Ezra and Derek for very eloquently diagnosing the problem, but I find it harder to then be like, okay, well, what do we do to like, how do we win elections again?
Yeah.
Because we can't just sit here and say like, oh well, I refuse to believe that we can't do something. Like
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is like there's always natural like thermostatic reaction, right? It's like I don't really fully know why people are like this, but basically anytime a president gets elected, people immediately start like turning away from them. Like the wokest we ever were as a country is like when Donald Trump was president. And when Biden was president, like suddenly became like less quote unquote woke, right? Like on immigration sentiment was the highest it's ever been, like pro-immigration in the first Trump term, and then it like turned all the way back under Biden. And you're already seeing some of this with special elections. But the reason I worry about that is like it will not be enough because we're in such a deep hole. Like if we win every election for the Senate in 2026 that is like remotely plausible, we will still not have a majority. And then 2028 it gets even worse because we're defending more like the only Republican senator that is sitting in a state that Joe Biden won is Susan Collins. Like versus there are many Democrats who are sitting in states and that Trump won like a huge margin and like they're in real trouble. And so like we have this like I think short term it'll be okay enough for us to just like he's going to fuck up, people are getting mad and we'll win, but it won't be enough to really like solve the deep structural deficits we have.
I think related to that is that there's a lot of people that are maybe saying publicly that I'm really pissed about what Trump is doing, but deep down inside, they're kind of like, no, we need a course correction. So we're going to sit back and let's see what happens. And I think there's some of that that's happening out there, at least kind of from what I've garnered on social media and people that I talk to. It's like, they're kind of like, yeah, he's an asshole. Yeah, he's a narcissist. Yeah, Musk is doing too much. But we did such a crappy job for the last 4 years, and I really think that 2020, I think the pandemic like compounded that whole thing because everything grinded to a halt,
Yeah.
right? So things were already deadlocked, and how long has Congress been gridlocked?
Yeah.
Since like the 90s, right? Since like after Clinton, it's pretty much been gridlocked, more or less. And so then it even created another layer of that gridlock on top of it. And so I think people, and Adam, you'd mentioned this, it came out of that angry.
Well, yeah, I've been surprised by the polling that shows that, like, despite what we're saying here, like Doge is immensely popular with most
Right.
people. Exporting the Venezuelan gangs even more popular,
Yes.
and everyone's wrapped up in the back and forth over the Judge Boasberg's order and whether or not they violated it and when the planes took off. But like that's the trees. The forest is like people they want swift action. They weren't seeing progress before. He's doing what he said he was going to do, even if you don't like it. People are impressed by the illusion of competence and the idea that results are happening. But to me, the silver lining in all this is that like he's going to like bulldoze most of the federal government, and that will leave some fertile ground for Democrats who, when we get back in power, assuming that we're not going to become a dictatorship, like we could build something better on top of it. I know that as good as he is at destroying stuff, like he has no interest, nor do his cronies, in building anything on top of it. And so I want to take these years to like prepare for what we will do to build better institutions that can provide better, higher quality, lower cost access to education and housing and healthcare. And I think that starts in San Francisco because we do control all the levers of power here. We have a common sense mayor again and a more moderate board. I'm curious, like if you were again with a magic wand, like let's say you were his comms director, because I think that's an open spot right now. Like what story
Are
would
you
you?
applying, Armand?
I'm looking for a job, so
We can hook you up.
Mayor Lurie.
Yeah.
If you were him, like what story would you want to tell about San Francisco?
I mean, I think I'd tell the story that they're trying to tell now, which is that like we're getting things under control. Like we had San Francisco's coming back, we're fixing things. One thing I think is very smart is that Mayor Lurie understands that voters are giving him some grace, right? He's like new, it's only been a few months. And he's doing things visibly, like we're seeing in terms of enforcement, like these high profile raids, and then like the stationing of like the command center at Mission 16th. And even though, to be honest, like some of it's frustrated me in that terms of like some of it, like there's not as much follow up in terms of like arrests and convictions. Even just the shows of force are clearly having like a deterrent effect. Like those areas are visibly, demonstrably better, right? And ultimately, like people really want, when you talk about like the whole feelings versus like the facts thing, I think for a long time we really focused on like, well, number of homicides or like number of like specific crimes or whatever. It's like a lot of what people feel about like safety is just like, does it feel safe to walk down the street, right? Does the city look visibly disordered? And I think the Lurie administration is taking a smart tack of like focusing on those visible signs of public disorder, but also like being like very careful not to be like San Francisco's back, but more like we're working on it. It's getting better. I think after voters are very impatient. I think if in a year, like they don't see like real change, they'll start souring. But he's got a bit of a leash right now, and I think he's taking really smart moves around like, permitting SF is this really the first most aggressive measure I've seen to like really top and bottom look at our permitting system. And I was actually working on a data project myself because I'm a nerd around like permitting, and I started plumbing permits. And one thing I realized is that like San Francisco, if you look at our code, we have exemptions for like what needs a permit and what doesn't. And if you compare it to other cities, there are a lot of other cities that have other exemptions. Like I don't remember exactly, but something like a certain kind of water heater or whatever. And like none of those cities have like a crisis of like faulty water heaters. Um, and I would hope that the administration is doing like taking a close look at like what are other cities doing? How has that worked? What do we actually need? Sort of like let's find all the different ways at sort of like individual level that add up to increase the burden of like building things and getting things done in San Francisco. Um, I think a lot of it too will weigh on like how successful he is in passing like some really like big legislation. Like there's going to be a big rezoning. It's going to be a big political fight, and it's going to be tough. If you can pull that off, I think that will really set the stage for a lot of things.
Yeah, I want to ask you about housing because
Mhm.
you are super involved in the YIMBY movement, and I want you to explain for regular people out there, even people who know a bunch about housing, like why has it been so hard to build housing in California for the past 30 years? Why have Democrats done such a fucking terrible job at it?
Well, actually, around the same time that like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson wrote this book Abundance, this guy named Mark Dunkelman wrote this book Why Nothing Works, and I think they're actually really good compliments because while Ezra and Derek talk about like specific present day issues, he does a really good historical context. And really, what big picture happened was like post World War II, we had like the greatest period of like physical growth in this country. Like, we had the baby boom, we built the interstate highways, we had so many new homes built. Like, if you look at like people think of the 2008 as this big housing boom, but if you look at it like a chart, it'd be like post World War II is like this, and 2008 was like this, like nothing. Um, and a lot of that had a lot of harm. Like there's enormous amount of pollution, like communities, Robert Moses built a lot of great parks, but he also like bulldozed through communities to build big freeways. Um, and this was sort of like the beginning of the environmental movement. Um, and there was a large sort of effort to be like, we've grown too fast. This is too much. We need to take back power. And really, it's like Ralph Nader in the 70s sort of what's called like the public interest law movement, where it was oriented around suing government and restraining the power of government. And like this has sort of evolved in a lot of zillion different ways, but like one of the reasons that like housing is so difficult to build is sort of the merger of that, which is like around local control, constraining government from allowing building of housing. Um, then also like there's the long history of zoning being used as like as a tool for like segregation, right? Like the first zoning in America was done explicitly where they'd be like, there's zoning for black people and there's zoning for white people. And then the Supreme Court said we can't do that. So then, and they wrote this down, they had meetings about this. They're like, how can we make this happen without being explicitly racial? Well, if we make some neighborhoods single family zoning and they're really expensive, like poor people won't be able to afford to move there. And I think while a lot of that still happens, a lot of that still like is a really powerful sentiment, it's kind of merged into this like sort of unholy beast with like the post like the 70s era like new left movement of like restraint of government, process, procedure, community engagement, like basically and zoning was like a pre-existing tool that could be used for that. And I think like I know I'm kind of over the place, but I want to just say like it's a long big history, but essentially at its core it's just like we have these tools that existed to constrain growth, and a lot of different interests for a lot of their own different reasons have like built and expanded and created the entire regimen of those tools. And it's not just the United States, like the UK is terrible at it. A lot of like until very recently, like New Zealand was terrible at it, a lot of particularly English speaking countries.
So how do we unwind it?
You part of it's just like it's a movement. Like I've been, like I said earlier, like I started doing YIMBY stuff 10 years ago. I went to like a panel on housing that Sonia Traus is like the godmother of the YIMBY movement was speaking, because I worked on affordable housing tax credit policy at the time. And she's like this crazy lady who's like going to planning commission hearings, but when nobody who was pro housing was doing that. And she recruited me. And within a week, my roommate's like, who's this crazy woman that you're following to like the Sunshine Task Force? And over time, it's like, one thing I'm very proud of is like I am a footnote in this history, in the sense that like there's a book, Golden Gates by Connor Doherty, which talks about the history of it. And I have like one line in there, and I was very proud of my one line. And you build a movement. This takes time. You have to organize, you have to persuade people. It is very funny to now see like a bunch of politicians like act like they always agreed with it, when I know for a fact they didn't. But it's gonna take, yeah. I mean, I don't really have a better answer than like we have to keep working, persuading people. It's a long fight. It took us many, many years to even get like ADU laws passed, which is the most easy, obvious one, because we pass a law and then local jurisdictions would find ways to get around it. So you'd have to pass another law. And it was like whack-a-mole for like 4 years before finally they're like, okay, we can't wriggle out of this. And now ADUs are 20% housing construction in California.
So Armand, the city has a housing element that they have to meet by, was it 2028? Right?
Yeah.
And they're supposed to basically build around 10,000 homes a year. And I think last year they approved 1,200 homes
Yeah.
to be built. So what happens in 2029 when they don't meet that housing element? Is the state going to really take over and start making zoning decisions on where things are going to be built, or are they just going to kick the can down the road again?
So there's a trigger in the housing element that halfway through the cycle will force the city to undergo like another assessment process. And we are not hitting that goal. And it will likely require the city to reduce more constraints or do more upzoning. I think it's still unlikely we'll hit the actual target in 2028, but it is true that like, frankly, every jurisdiction is going to, because like the process didn't include enough teeth to actually make cities do it. Like Sausalito is now like, this is like insane. So Sausalito decided to require all developers to provide data on how like buildings will affect visual impacts, percentage on like historical views. And they say they'll assess this with software, but the software doesn't exist. They're like, you should give us data for this hypothetical software we will one day create to block housing. And so it's like, it's a real, I think the whole process, frankly, like what the state is realizing, like Senator Wiener and Assemblymember Wicks introduced more legislation to sort of just like, for example, make all dense infill housing exempt for California Environmental Quality Act review. There's no automatic thing that happens in 2028 if we don't hit those goals, but policymakers are waking up and realizing that the current process is not effective at inducing cities to build more housing. And so they're just taking a stronger hand. And I think I expect more and more legislation along those lines.
Why not just like be bolder? Like, why not repeal CEQA? Why not pass a proposition to give the governor like strong executive powers on housing? Just like go over the top of all this back and forth legislatively, where people take years to pass stuff and then go around it and then pass new stuff. Like that's this whole process feels like part of the like Dems not delivering vibe that everybody is rejecting. Like why not pick a different path here?
Well, I'll say like on the legislation that Buffy Wicks has put out this year would essentially like remove all housing that's built in a city, which is called infill from CEQA, which would be huge. Like, I want more housing to people in general, and understand some of that will be sprawl, but like that is not my like priority as an environmentalist. But you're right. I mean, there was an attempt in 2016. Governor Jerry Brown put in his like budget bill, which like when the governor puts in his budget bill, it's the most powerful thing he can do. It is known like throughout the Capitol that like this is the governor's huge priority. Voting it down would be massive, and it was like really, really aggressive, like upzoning throughout the state. And ironically, it was a time that people were kind of like, they didn't realize how big a deal it was, and so the opposition wasn't so mobilized. But also there was like not so much mobilization in favor, and so it kind of like people got mad. The governor didn't want to have the fight, and he took it out. And unfortunately, the year after, like the like livable California and like NIMBY groups didn't really exist statewide, and they were created specifically in response to that because they're like, oh wow, the state's like taking an interest in making us build housing. And then Senator Wiener tried to introduce SB 827, which would have been like a really massive statewide upzoning, and that got killed. The truth is that like after that, we then started to try to pursue a bunch of different approaches that were piecemeal. And some of them worked and some haven't. And I think this year, sort of like the philosophy of the assembly, at least, is like we wanted to go really big. And so like the two bills, the Senator Wiener, Assemblymember Wicks have, are like really, really big. I hope they don't get watered down. I hope they pass. But like, I think we're finally like trying to like go for the big take a big bite of the apple. But I totally agree that like I was telling the governor of like Maryland, we were doing an interview for podcast YIMBYs for Harris became YIMBY Democrats for America. And I was like, one thing I really wanted to press upon them is like, the more complicated you make this and the more like, oh, I want to get exactly precisely right, the more people will find ways to like disregard it and fight it. And you just need to, bigger you can go, the cleaner you can go, the better. But
is there anything we can learn from red states? Because you mentioned the electoral map before.
Mhm.
The reason it's getting harder for Dems to win nationally is because people are moving to red states. The reason they're moving to red states is because cost of living is lower in red states, because there's more housing. They've been able to make life more affordable for more people. And so that's why it'll be harder for us to win elections unless we can figure out how to win in red states and purple states. But is there anything we can learn from the way that they approach housing?
Mhm. Well, so one thing that's really interesting in red states is that like the overall state environment is controlled by Republicans, and therefore there are not a lot of like, there's no like CEQA in Texas, right? And so there's not a lot of like state imposed burdens on local home building, and that's really allowed like a lot of housing to get built. But also a lot of places like Austin, which are like governed by Democrats, are building a lot. And in part that's because like YIMBYs have a lot of success like at the city council there. I think part of it though, what we're facing is a lot of these jurisdictions are running into like sprawl has a limit in the sense that like you can build a lot of housing further and further out, but you need to be somewhat close to your job to sustain it, right? There's only so many people who want to drive 3 hours every day back and forth. Um, and what we're seeing actually, because the pandemic pushed a lot of people into like the Sun Belt and other areas, and they started building and so on, but they're sort of like reaching those limits. And so those places have been very fertile for growth in the past with a combination of like a state environment that doesn't like actively fight housing, and then some jurisdictions that have been like moving towards being pro housing. Um, but I worry that if they don't take more proactive steps to like have the state make it actively easier to build in cities, they'll start running into like their actual sprawl limits. Because the truth is, like most of Austin's construction has not been like tall buildings in the urban center. It's just like Austin's really big as a physical space, and so they built a lot of stuff throughout it. But with congestion and just distance to job centers, there's only so far you can go, and it's kind of like part of the reason California had this huge housing crisis is like we've like already like built out a lot, like the low hanging fruit has been picked a long time ago. And that's why you're saying like people have told me for many years, like, well, this housing stuff, it only matters in like San Francisco and New York. We did YIMBYs for Harris, which is this like big event trying to get support for Kamala Harris. I had the mayors of like Cincinnati and Milwaukee like wanting to speak. And that would not have been true 10 years ago.
Mhm.
So I think they do a lot. They've done a lot of great things, but I also think they're at this moment where if they don't step it up, they're in real danger of like Californication.
Yeah. And that they stop building housing or
They're gonna run out of like places basically where they can go further out in building, like where people will be able to commute to job centers.
Mhm.
You already like Phoenix, for example. Phoenix built a ton of housing, and it kept going further and further. But like, people are not going to commute 5 hours a day.
Is that your theory that like we built a bunch of single family homes and like easy stuff in the 50s and 60s, people moved in, and then like now that we need to densify those areas, people don't want to move out, and so we like have this uh inability to build, like, is that why California has calcified?
Well, no, because even in the 50s and 60s, we built a ton of infill dense housing. Like a lot of San Francisco was constructed after World War II. New York, for example, built like a huge ton of the housing is from that like 1940s to like 1960s era. Like a lot of people in New York, big percentage of the population in New York lives in buildings built in that time period.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's the case of it. But I do think like there are areas that like have low hanging fruit that previously there wasn't a lot of high housing demand. And so it's easy to like build up a bunch of housing that was still relatively close to job centers because it hadn't been filled up. But as that happens, like you either need to like figure out ways to like, which is very hard, like independently create a job center and then build housing around it. Or people need to accept like insanely long commutes, or you need to build taller in cities.
We talked about that last week about building taller, about Aaron Peskin in the waterfront and putting the 4-story caps on buildings,
Yeah.
and then going down to Fisherman's Wharf and seeing how dilapidated parts of it have become.
Yeah.
Part of that's from the pandemic, but part of it just looks shabby and it's like ripe for redevelopment. And I remember last year I went to Washington, D.C., and we went down to the Potomac, the waterfront, the riverfront on the Potomac, and they completely redesigned it and redeveloped it. And you've got 7 and 8-story buildings just lining the river. And people here, I remember I posted those pictures on Twitter and everyone jumped on me here saying, well, we have earthquakes. I'm like, so, okay, so whether it's an 8-story or a 4-story building, an earthquake is an earthquake, right? But we could do so much instead. Like, we just refuse to like pull the trigger, so to speak, on a lot of this, on a lot of those big redevelopment ideas. Um, and then it gets compounded by us pulling the trigger on a big redevelopment type idea like high speed rail, which is development, right? And then it gets bogged down in regulation and other stuff. So I'm not really sure like how um, California is going to unlock that, right? With its current leadership. I mean, I've been to Sacramento a bunch of times and I've tried to work with the state assembly and the state senate on issues around criminal justice and drugs, drug policy, homeless policy, et cetera. And the amount of I don't want to say it's dysfunction because it's not dysfunction, but there's just a resistance to do anything that's a departure from a very narrow view
Yeah.
of how they see things in elected leadership and representative government.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's like a complacency. It's like we've accepted that we think that like this is how it has to be. Like it's just always going to be like this. Like that's how it felt under Breed in San Francisco. We're like, oh, the streets are just going to be like the 16th and Mission. We just have to live with this forever. And like it was like this vibe. I've been saying that a lot, but it's like this reality that we've all accepted. Like the police accepted it, our elected officials accepted it, residents accepted it. I feel that way about housing too. And like the hub, there's so many areas of the city like Market and Van Ness where like no one lives there. It's just car dealerships where they could where they did zone it to build huge high-rise towers. They could build 10,000 units or something like that there. Parts of Soma, like nobody lives there. It's just old factories and warehouses and highways. Like it would be perfect places to build, and yet we haven't. And that feels like I worry about this this technocratic response of like, oh, we have let's like look at all the things, and yeah, the sum of all of these changes could be really significant. Yeah, maybe, but it could take years to do, and then like I have kids by then or something like that. I don't understand why we like this. What I think Mayor Lurie's approach initially to drugs and homelessness has been like, let me expand the Overton window about what people think is possible here and make people believe that things can be different, and like that changes other people's decisions too. And
Yeah.
I don't know why we can't do the same on housing, where the ability to like exempt developers from certain requirements is in the hands of the planning department and the mayor, and like they could wave their wand and like let stuff happen. Like why aren't they being more aggressive? Why can't they just approve all the permits that are in the queue, with certain preconditions, like approve all essentially, or accept all? Like what's the harm in bigger, grander steps to at least just like change people's sense of what's possible?
Yeah. No, I agree. I am hopeful that they'll take those actions. But just to touch on something Tom said earlier, two things. Like one on the earthquakes, the way I always respond to those people is to say like Tokyo.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Tokyo's
Hong
massive
Kong.
earthquakes. And if anything, like the most dangerous part of San Francisco to be in during a big earthquake would be the Sunset, which is
Right.
all single family homes, because they're all like very old construction, not up to modern earthquake code, and on sand dunes.
Right.
You're much safer in like the Salesforce Tower than you are in like a single family home in the Sunset if the big one comes. The second thing with like the waterfront, it reminded me of this story years ago. There was like a project that I was like advocating for some other YIMBYs. And it was like sort of like the ideal thing in that it was like big dense housing in the middle of like a transport core. It was like near the waterfront. Like it was a super rich neighborhood, so there's no like concerns of like it'll gentrify people out. And the Sierra Club locally opposed it. And I was like, why do you oppose a project that will bring dense infill housing to a most transit rich neighborhood in San Francisco? Like, this is a no brainer. And they said, well, some people in the building next door will have less of a view of the waterfront, and that will make them think about the environment less. So they'll be less of environmentalists. Like, and this is like dealing with ideas. Like you can try to fight individual ideas like that for a long time, but sort of to what Adam said is like at a certain point you just need to stop indulging those and stop giving them avenues for opposition and tools that they can use to indulge those, because you'll hear a bunch of just like things that 99% of people think are crazy, but like one person can raise their hand, pay $50 and put an entire process to a halt.
I'm curious, we all met, I guess, on Twitter. How do you, and looking at your numbers, you have super impressive growth in your followers. I think you've gone from 46,000 last June to 74,000 today. You've like doubled your following. And I'm sure that means you're spending a bunch of time on Twitter. How do you stay sane in the cesspool that it has become?
Well, I probably don't, but um, the ways I found it to be healthy are when like there are times when I like break this and I'm like stressed out or mad or something. It's like, my mom smokes. I tweet. Like it's not it's somewhat of a vice, but I find a lot of joy when I learn things or I can like write clarified thoughts that I think like are being missed from the conversation that like put things together and give people new insight. So those are things that make me happier about it. There's also just like, what's interesting? It's like a weird psychological thing is like I write better tweets and I'm less stressed about it when I'm writing them on my computer. But something about it being on the phone is all that like dopamine circles. Like I just like see something somebody says that's like mean and nasty. I'm like, fuck you. Like, so I think it's like a thing that can have a lot of positive stuff in my life, in people's lives. But it's also a thing that like you just need to like draw clear boundaries around. So like when I'm working, I put the phone in the other room. So I might still write a tweet, but there's less of a compulsion to do so. And when I find, frankly, that like it's too like I get sucked into like arguing with someone who's like clearly bad faith, just like wants to take me down, will twist everything I say to the most insane version of it. Like I would say even a year ago, I'd like go down all those rabbit holes. Now I just like tell myself like there's nothing you can do. This person just feels shitty about their life and they want somebody else to feel shitty. So you have to have a theory of mind about like the folks you're engaging with.
I come across the same thing. There's a cabal of radical nut jobs in San Francisco that it's funny, they rotate. There's about 10 people that they target in San Francisco, and I'm happy to say I'm one of those 10 people because my views on harm reduction are sometimes critical, and I advocate for holding homeless people accountable, and people get mad about that, and I'm just like, well, that's part of the continuum, right? Whether they want to admit it or not. Then they get mad as the platform grows, right?
Yeah.
And now I'm writing articles in national media. You're showing up in national media, New York Times, etc. Right? So it's funny, you become a target for
Yeah.
some of those folks, and it sometimes it gets to you, but most of the time you just tune it out and just keep pushing forward. That's the key, at least for me.
Something we talk about a lot is like Twitter itself. Do you think that Dems should be investing in Twitter, like both with their time really and their engagement? Like, is it, it's owned by Elon? The algorithm has changed. Like, do you still think there's a lot of people have decamped to Blue Sky, which has its own problems, but do you think Dems should still be on Twitter?
I think so because like one thing that this election really taught me, it's like I have no more patience for this. Like, oh, you went on a podcast. It's like a bad person. Like, are you platforming them? Like, at one point, people were talking about platforming Joe Rogan. I was like, he's giving you a platform.
Yeah, he has a platform.
That's this whole like insane idea that like somebody could be platforming the most popular podcast on the fucking planet. Like, um, whether X or Twitter is the right place to do it. Like everybody's got to make that call for themselves. But like this idea that like we should not be in spaces where people disagree with us is like we lost. Like you have to persuade people. I find it useful to be on there because frankly, like it's become such a vehicle of like, especially through Elon, he's just like routinely says things that are not true. They're easy to disprove. Like he'll be like, I canceled this contract that was like giving condoms to Gaza, and it turns out it's like Gaza, Mozambique, and it's like anti-STD drugs, not condom, and all this stuff. Like, um, having somebody there to like counter. Plus, journalists are there, and journalists will be there to cover it. And if the journalists only see the perspectives that like the other side is presenting, I think it will seep into their coverage and distort it. So like there need to be people there. After election, it's kind of funny. Like most of my most viral tweets have just been like very calmly saying like this thing, this big right-wing influencer said is not true. Here's why. It's like not even arguing or being combative. It's just like basic fact check. I think we can't see those spaces, unfortunately, like as pleasant as it might be.
Yeah.
I agree with him. Like the 20 million people that left that went to Blue Sky, they're just living in an echo chamber at this point.
Yeah.
And it's just not helping their cause. And it's just, in my opinion, it gives Elon even more juice,
Right.
right? They should come back and mix it up. And that's what Twitter was all about before. It was maybe a little kinder and friendlier and a little less right leaning, but it was pretty far left leaning sometimes too. So
Yeah.
it's all about finding balance. And, you got to be able to roll with the punches. And these people, everyone running away all hurt, I think they'll come back eventually. You got to remember, it's only been, what, 2.5 months? A little over 2 months since Trump took office.
Yeah.
That's not a long time.
Yeah.
And it's,
Wow.
2028 is a long ways away. So there's a long period of time here that we're going to have this Trump is president, JD Vance is there, Elon, that he may step back, right, from his role. I think he was only supposed to Doge for like 5 months, and then he was going to step back.
Technically, yeah. Under
Yeah.
30 days.
So we'll see, right? A lot of unanswered questions still to come. So it's like a movie, man. I want to get my popcorn and watch,
Yeah.
and occasionally be invited on set to participate. I'm cool with that.
I do think one thing that Blue Sky does, which I wish Twitter would go back to, is like Twitter kills links. And I enjoy on Blue Sky like having conversations that are like very detailed about like with people who are experts in their field, because as like they post articles and people can respond to other articles, and there's like a lot more meat versus like Elon is like made really, the biggest thing people go viral for is like a screenshot of a headline, and then like people just like make up shit that was not actually in the article. And it's just like sometimes like the article will be like agreeing with their opinion on an issue, but they like misunderstood the headline or was poorly written, and they'll never read the article. They'll just see the screenshot, and it's like, I think, and this is something both like I noticed like right-wing people and left-wing people are like constantly like badgering Elon about like please make it like don't kill links, but he hasn't changed it. I wish he would.
Well, Elon, if you're listening, please don't kill links.
Yes.
All right. Well, Armand, thank you.
Thank
for
you.
coming on,
This was
man.
fun.
I met you a few months ago at a Grow SF thing, and I'm glad we were able to make the connection. We're friends
Yeah.
on Twitter, and here you are. And
I like that we agree on a lot of things, but we also strongly disagree on a lot of things, and we can still get along. Like
that's
yeah.
how it's supposed to be, man. Right?
Yeah.
That's how it's supposed to be. So
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you.
And everyone else, we'll see you next time.
see you next time.